All right. This is going to be an interesting, different feel than the last few classes. So I still have to stand up awkwardly because we got a camera that only reaches like so wide.
Just remember, your audience is...
I know, my audience is broad.
Over the years, it's just going to grow and grow and grow.
However, given the room, this can be much more interactive discussionary, right? I have things that I want to cover that by all means will take all the time we have. But I'd rather spend time talking about stuff if you have stuff you want to talk about. So, full disclosure, what we're going to talk about tonight is largely not related to apologetics in any way. It is in a very major way, which we're going to cover at the end, because what we're really going to learn about is a totally different and antithetical worldview to the worldview we've been building up, the worldview that we have as believers in God and Jesus and the nature of reality that we know to be true, right? We're going to learn about an entirely different view on the nature of reality, and we're going to see how when you abandon a lot of the things we've been learning about the last few classes, that things from a normal person's perspective get very crazy very quickly, okay? So what we're going to learn about tonight, I'm going to refer to as critical theory. You could hear it referred to as contemporary critical theory. Yeah, thank you. You can also hear it referred to as cultural Marxism, postmodernism. These are all words in a pantheon that kind of are all starting to describe the same worldview. Come on in. Good deal. Sorry. Pick a seat, any seat. Just don't knock over the camera. So, to begin, you need to learn a little bit of a history lesson, and then we're actually going to revert back to a history lesson at the end. So, not casting shade on anybody, but raise your hand if you had a chance to watch the video by Shenvi. Did anybody watch that video? The one where he talked about critical theory and Christianity and whether or not they're compatible. Just one. Okay, good. I just needed to know from a realm of where...
His introduction was good.
Yeah, it's a great video. You should watch it. You need to watch it because it's going to cover a lot of the theological contradictions between critical theory and Christianity that I'm probably not going to get into as much tonight. He takes in that video a position where he's analyzing critical theory as a worldview and how it's incompatible with Christianity, and that we really need to guard against it coming into the church, because inevitably it ends up coming into conflict with the gospel, and you have to pick between one or the other. And in most of these churches where critical theory is infiltrating, Bible-believing churches, they're starting to subvert Scripture and the gospel with the worldviews we're going to learn about tonight. They're starting to look at the gospel through the lens of critical theory instead of looking at everything through the lens of the Bible and the gospel, right? The truth of Christianity and the reality that we know through the last few classes calls us to look at the rest of the world through that lens, not look at the Bible through any other lens, right? So, with that, most of this class is just going to be learning about what is this stuff and what are the consequences of some of the beliefs. So, to understand critical theory, you kind of got to understand the history of where it comes from. So, hopefully everyone in the world has heard of this man, Karl Marx. He came up with most of his major ideas in the mid-19th century. Most of us are familiar with Marxism and the Communist Manifesto. Communism is an outflow of the worldview and the ideas that Marx proposed as Marxism. So communism and their would be arguments out there that it was the imperfect implementation of Marxism, but it is at least inarguably built on his ideas, however imperfect it was implemented. But Marxism is what eventually led to communism in Russia, and then in China, and then in Cambodia, and then led to the rise of conflict between, the freedom-loving democracies of the world and the communist nations of the world. So that's 1840s. In the early 20th century, you had the Frankfurt School in Germany, where a lot of philosophers were coming up with new ideas, and this is where the term critical theory first arises. So if you actually are going to talk about critical theory in a narrow definition, it is the ideologies and philosophy that come out of the Frankfurt School, Max Horkheimer and some of his colleagues in the mid-20th century. We're going to learn that they are very much a play off of Marxism, and they've been adapted, they've changed since then. This is where this word first comes up. So the reason sometimes you hear this referred to as contemporary critical theory is because people have taken the Frankfurt School's ideologies and kind of built them up in other areas, but they all fundamentally rely on the same principles. And then Jacques Derrida is a philosopher out of France. He was born in like 1930. He actually didn't die till 2004. He's pretty influential in kind of how some of these ideas proliferated into more parts of society and got taken more seriously. I actually don't hold him accountable for how terrible some of these ideas are as the Frankfurt School and Karl Marx. A lot of his ideas were actually kind of distorted. I mean, anyway, the only reason I put this up there is, one, I'm going to go over a brief overview of all of them, but two, it's like, if you want to, and you should go learn more about this, particularly for you people under the age of 30, you need to know this stuff, and we'll get into that at the end. But if you want to learn more about the history, these are your bullet points of what you can dig into. And you should know a lot about this, which we'll cover that at the end. So, to prove that these all tie in, let's look at Karl Marx a little bit, right? He wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848. One of the major underlying ideas he had was an idea of a new despotism. So despotism is when someone rules over you in tyrannical oppression, right? And the idea was that it's not just a single tyrant anymore. It is the idea of a despotism of capitalism. It is a system, a societal system that is actually oppressive. And so it's harder to point to an individual tyrant and say, he's the oppressor. It's actually this system that we all live in that's oppressing a lot of us, right? So that's a new thought, is that you have despotism of a system, or a tyrannical system that you all live in. Obviously, if you know anything about Marx, he broke that down mostly around class struggle in terms of the means of capitalism and production. So if you've ever heard of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, those who were the workers, and you still hear about worker parties around the world, like there is the Worker Party in the UK, that's all coming out of Marxism. So the oppressor class in the Marxist era was always viewed through the lens of wealth and the controls of the means of production. So the oppressed class was the worker class, the oppressor class was those who owned private property, the means of production, the wealthy, those were the bourgeoisie or the capitalists, right? He was also one of the first to denote that ideology itself. So you'll hear this word ideology thrown around the political spectrum all the time, right? Ideology, again, is just, it's like a worldview. It's a cultural, societal held set of beliefs that we all have to share in order to build a society, right? There's, at some level, in order for us to be in the same room and work productively together, to go to church together, to make families together, at some level you have to have a shared set of beliefs or ideas, or it breaks down, you end up in warfare, right? So when you think of ideology, that's really it. It's like cultural norms fall into there sometimes, sometimes not. So he was the first to say that all ideas in an ideology reflect the interests of a particular class at a particular point in time, and the contemporaries, so the people who are at that time that hold those beliefs, they see them as universal and eternal, but they're not. Okay, so some of that is true, and some of that's not true, and we're going to see that in a lot of ways. So he was the first to kind of point to ideology, that the people who currently hold that ideology feel like it's true and right, but he was the first to kind of question that it's not right and not necessarily true just because everyone now thinks it is, right? So he was kind of the first to kind of point to societal beliefs as potentially being fundamental in societal oppression. So we have this capitalist system that we all believe is good. He's actually saying it's not necessarily good, and actually the fact that we all believe it's good is contributing to our whole societal oppression of each other, right? And he was also the first to bring up this idea of a base superstructure relationship in society. So by that I mean the base is kind of all the stuff. It's the property, the means of production, the people, the commodities, the different classes of people. It's literally the physical stuff that makes up the society. And the superstructure over top of it are the ideology. So ideology, he puts under that category law, politics, education, culture, religion, art, family, philosophy, media. It's the total conglomerate of the ideas and philosophies held by that society are the superstructure which paint the picture for the base underneath. All the people and all the means get viewed through the lens of the superstructure, which is also true, right? I mean, it's hard to abstract your culture and your philosophical worldviews from how you treat reality. I mean, we do that same thing. So there's truth in there. So that's some on Marx, right? The Frankfurt School, 1938, Horkheimer describes critical theory analyzes the significance of the ruling or dominant ideology generated in the bourgeois society in order to show that the dominant ideology misrepresents how real human relations occur. Okay, so let me break that down. You have a oppressing class, a ruling class. So going back to Marxism, you have the ruling class that owns the means of productions. They are the rich. And they, by and large, in their view, get a bigger hand in determining what the dominant ideology is, what the dominant culture is, what is determined right, what is determined wrong, what is determined valuable, what is determined invaluable, right? And critical theory is a way of analyzing the dominant cultural ideology to show that it actually is untrue. It misrepresents how real human relations occur. And so that's going to be a dominant thing we focus on tonight, is that cultural norms or the dominant ideology of a culture is almost definitionally untrue because it's the culture of the dominant part of society. And the dominant part of society can't really understand what real human life is like because they're the dominant class. If you're not the non-dominant or oppressed class, you can't understand the truth of reality because your whole view is jaded by being the dominant class, right? So it's this idea that you don't have access to the truth of what it's like to be a human because you're not in the oppressed class. And that kind of is what we're going to get into next. So these ideas are what we're going to get into. I'm just spending way too much time showing that what we're going to cover the whole rest of the class actually comes from these things. The reason I do that is you'll hear a lot of people argue that the connection to Marxism is not, I mean, it's all there. Read the Communist Manifesto and then take out the word means of production and capitalist and add in the word racist, and it's all the same ideas. So first, what is critical theory. So there are a lot of ways that people describe this, a lot of ways you can describe it. I'm going to describe it through a few main premises. Premise one is that hierarchies only come about through power and oppression. Another major premise is that objectivity is illusory. All is subjective. In my notes I have here equity over equality, and I'm actually just going to say over everything. So these are the primary topics we're going to dig into tonight. And as we dig into them, you'll start to understand more when people are talking about critical race theory or critical queer theory or critical whatever theory. They all fall underneath these premises, right? So premise number one, which is extremely important to understand, is that critical theory points to hierarchies only forming as a result of power. And when I say power, I mean like coercion, force, that sort of power, money, power, influence, right? The things we think of when we think of vices. And the use of that power in corrupt ways to oppress people to then obtain more power or to perpetuate their power. So, hierarchy is only based on corrupt application of power to acquire more power and solidify domination. All domination or superiority of position in any organization or any part of culture is due to corruption and not because of any actual superiority of ideas or capabilities. Okay? And when I say hierarchies, hierarchies are everywhere for you young people, right? Hierarchies are how we really organize everything. There's a hierarchy of responsibility and authority in this church, in your family, on your basketball team, right?
In this room.
In this room. I'm standing up here talking and you guys are listening to me. There's hierarchies in every business organization. In the military. You can't name a place where there's not a hierarchy.
Even in like your peer groups.
Even in your peer groups.
Hierarchies.
And they're malleable depending on what your peer group's doing, right? If you're going to go play baseball or basketball and you play baseball and you don't, you might become naturally, without even thinking about it in your peer group, the one who's like telling people where to go. And then if all of a sudden the next day you're going fishing and he's the fisherman in the group and you've never fished before, you're just naturally going to subject yourself because he's the expert in fishing. They are natural. They happen in animals. There are actual neurological systems in the brains of animals that show hierarchy's been around for a long time. They're necessary for successfully and effectively organizing anything. Critical theory points to hierarchy as only being a result of these two things. And so here's a quote from a book called Five Faces of Oppression. So, oppression in its classical definition, so this is not a quote, this is from my notes. Oppression in a classical definition is actually acts of cruelty, violence, injustice, or coercion. That's what we think of when we think of oppression. You're literally performing evil acts on someone to force them or coerce them to do something. They could be non-physical, like you could be blackmailing someone, right? Think of oppression, think of, Egypt and the slaves, or slavery in the United States, or pick any tyrannical system throughout history. That's what we think of when we think of oppression, right? But here's the quote. In its new usage, oppression designates the disadvantages and injustice some people suffer, not because a tyrannical power coerces them, but because of everyday practices of a well-intentioned liberal society. Its causes are embedded in unquestioned norms, habits, and symbols of that society. So we're redefining oppression under critical theory. Oppression is not just violence and coercion, but is also a result of the everyday practices of the dominant ideology, right? I can be oppressed by the cultural norms or societal ideas at large, okay? So that's a whole new definition for this. And so now, if you presume...
They do a lot of redefining terms.
Oh, they do a ton of redefining of terms. And we'll find out why in this.
Yeah.
If there is no objectivity, I have a quote in here about language, and there's a reason why it seems so rapidly that definitions change on the fly and mean different things, and it's because they're shaping reality with language. Instead of language being a means to describe objective reality, it's because everything is subjective, I can use language to shape reality, because there is no reality. So, underneath this, we get a couple things. So underneath the idea that all hierarchies are based on power and oppression, we get a couple very fundamental ideas that you've all heard. You probably have never gotten a breakdown what they mean. Have anybody heard of these two?
Intersectionality, yes. Social binary, no.
So that social binary is then how you analyze things intersectionally. So this comes straight from Marx and has been expanded since through critical theory. But that all of society can be broken down into social binaries of oppressed and oppressor groups. So Marx talked about it in these terms a little bit, but pretty much stayed focused completely on capitalism. While due to the horrors of communism and the complete collapse of any economy that really tried the communist system, this idea as applied to capitalism kind of fell out of vogue for a long time because there was a lot of very visceral evidence to everyone who was alive at the time that it wasn't a good theory. But now we've taken that thing and applied it to everything, and now we're applying it to economics again, but as well as everything else. So social binary is that all societal groups can be broken down in a binary system. That means 0 or 1, on or off, oppressor or oppressed. And you've all heard of some of these groups. I have a list of them written here. There are more. I couldn't even fit them all on here, okay? You have racism, white, non-white. The class of binary here would be racism. So all your isms are like the axis on which you're measuring oppressor or oppressed. You have gender. Oh, this is sex, actually. Sexism, male, non-male. Gender, masculine, feminine. You have economic status, financially stable, financially insecure. You have sexuality or heteroism, I think is what they call it. Heterosexual being the oppressor, queer being the oppressed. You know, you have Eurocentrism. You have what they call credentialism. I have credentials because I have a degree, and you might have not gotten a degree or a lesser degree than me, and I might be viewed as educated, you less educated. Ableism, which I'm sure you've heard. This is not just able as in physically abled, it is also mentally abled. I don't have depression, you do have depression. There's ageism, where middle-aged is by far the most preferred class, young and old being the oppressed class. But there are, you might notice there's shades of grays in all of these. If you haven't like you've heard a bunch of these a lot. And if you think some of these start to get more obscure, you're just not paying attention. There's people talking about how attractive you are. So there's an attractiveness privilege. There's a
I can claim to be impressed.
there's a fitness there's a we've all heard of fat shaming and body image shaming, right? We have a fit versus fat oppressed group, and I could have wrote something more PC there. Some of them I was some PC. So here I was PC. Smart, less smart. English speaking, or what they call Anglophile, someone who speaks English as their first language versus English as a second language. Christian is the dominant religious class, non-Christian the non-dominant. There's fertilityism, whether you're fertile or non-fertile. The list is literally endless, and they come up with new ones all the time. Now what you notice here is most of these are treated like a binary, but they're not binaries, right? So there is actually a whole new class now called colorism, because we can't just say white and non-white. It's how light is your skin. A light-colored black person could be an oppressor of an oppressed black person. They might not say that if you were a black person. I don't know how you say it, black person, I guess African descent. But someone from Lebanon who might be brown, but less brown than someone from Nigeria, could fall in this category. Same with financially stable. They have one for upbringing. So on this side, you might say I had a wealthy upbringing and I was middle class or lower class. But then if I'm comparing a middle class to a lower class, middle class would be over here, right? How attractive is attractive enough to get you over here? It's a shifting baseline for all of these. How educated, how less educated, how able-bodied, how less able, right? How financially stable or how financially insecure, how masculine, how feminine, right? They are written as binaries. Almost none of them are actually binary conditions, right? So this...
Since they like to focus on binaries, why is it that they take something that God actually did make a binary, man and woman, and say it's a spectrum? Like all these things that are a spectrum, they say this is a binary. And then there's something God created, binary, and they say, well, that's a spectrum.
So they acknowledge these as spectrums. The binary is whether or not the dominant culture, which they refer to as the hegemony, Hegemony, whether or not the hegemony accepts you as the dominant class. And so whether or not the word is minoritized or not. It's not minority, it's not based on whether you're mathematically a smaller portion of the population or not. It's whether or not you're minoritized, right? And so because the people who hold the power are viewed as male, anyone who views themselves as male is taking on the privilege of all the power and the ideas that generate that cultural dominance.
Unless they were born female.
Or unless they want to identify themselves as not male, right? And then they would automatically jump into that category. So what you realize is that you fit into a category for every single one of these. Some might be on one side or the other, right? But you need all of these and more to describe yourself as an individual. And this is where the idea of intersectionality comes in. So if we have a person that we split down the middle with one side being the oppressor and one side being the oppressed, right? The way they talk about it is there are axes with which you can measure yourself. And these are different dimensions over which you can draw on axes, right? So it's like you can draw a bunch of fancy graphs for this, but basically it's how many attributes do I have on the oppressor side versus the oppressed side. So I'm collecting attributes, and this is where I live at the intersection me as an individual, I live at the intersection of my social binaries. I am a non-white, trans woman, non-European, right? You've heard people describe themselves. This is intersectionality. They're planting themselves as an individual on the map of all the oppressed, oppressor, social binary classes. Okay? So, all hierarchies are built on power. The people who hold higher positions in a hierarchy only hold those positions because they were corrupt and used power to acquire them, and now that they have acquired some power, they continually use that power to gain more power and oppress those below them in their hierarchy to maintain their position of dominance in the hierarchy. Got that? So all of society is made up of tiny little hierarchies that build to a big societal hierarchy. That's this view. Yes?
So is intersectionality a process by which people are classified into those? I guess I'm trying to understand.
Yes.
I understand those classifications. I'm just trying to define intersectionality. Is that what a process?
Yeah, and it's
of ranking oneself?
Yes. And so, in any conversation between two people, I need to determine, in order to know the truth, which is what we're going to get into next, in order to know the truth and to know whose ideas are more valid with respect to a certain idea, I need to know who's the oppressor and who's the oppressed. So here I have a white female who's heterosexual but is non-European. Who's she talking to will depend on whether or not she's oppressed or the oppressor. So if she were talking to me, I now cannot speak anything with regard to objective truth regarding her femaleness or her non-European status, because only the oppressed can know, or, yeah, I think either of these, maybe all four of them. If she were talking to a non-white, queer, trans, non-European, she couldn't speak with any sort of truth claim to anything regarding those topics, right? She can't make any objective claim about that woman's worldview because she is now in the oppressor category, and her ability to see truth is obscured by her privilege over the less privileged person she's talking to. So intersectionality comes in when you're measuring individual to individual or group to group. And if I'm trying to relate to Brandon, we have to first consider our privileges relative to each other and determine which categories I have no authority to speak into because I'm in the oppressor category. That's how this intersectionality is used. Okay. And that takes us right into the next topic of there is no objectivity. More questions on this? We good? Okay. We're going to deconstruct this.
Sounds like a whole new set of class.
It is. It's just, well, class is in there. I didn't even write it on there, but the Marxist view of classes is just like the baby version of this. He just had one thing on the board. He had poor, rich, or capitalist, worker, and he didn't come up with the rest of this yet. So it's the same ideas, right? Okay, so topic 2 is subjectivity, rules, and also I'm going to throw in here this idea of non-essentialism. We'll only touch on this a little bit, but this gets back to everything is malleable. Knowledge, all knowledge is corrupted, might be spelling that wrong, by ideology. Claims of objectivity, I can't spell, are means of oppression. All truth is subjective only through the lived, you've heard this word before, lived experience of the oppressed. Okay. We're gonna critique critical theory next. So I'm not spending time objecting to these yet, because we'll do that next. So just understanding. Premise number 2 is that there is no such thing as objectivity. So we learned earlier that objectivity means knowledge comes from the object. This is an object. There are things about this object that are knowable whether I exist or not. They are unchangeable whether I'm viewing this object or not, right? This bottle is cylindrical, it's made out of steel, its atoms have a certain number of proteins. Truth claims that are not relative to who's making the truth claim is an objective thing, right? Subjective, we learned before, means the claim is dependent on the subject making the claim, okay? Critical theory holds to that all knowledge, all human knowledge, is impossible to not be corrupted by the ideology, the cultural worldviews, the philosophy of the person who is consuming or creating or writing down that knowledge. All human knowledge is corrupted by ideology, which means you cannot have objectivity. If the truth claim is always painted by the subject who's understanding the truth claim, it becomes a subjective truth claim. So everybody kind of got that? So they're saying nothing is objective. People who claim that things are objective, who I can, with empirical evidence, show something to be true, or try to make a rationed argument for why this is a better way to do something than that, trying to remove emotion and use rationality, right? Are actually just claiming objectivity as a way to continue oppressing. So objectivity or claims of reasoned argument is actually just the dominant cultural ideology using the idea of objectivity as a way to continue oppressing oppressed groups. So by this standard, anytime you try to make a reasoned argument to counter someone's idea, you are showing that you're just part of the dominant culture trying to maintain your power and dominance through oppression by trying to claim that you have some truth, that you know some true belief. With these two things, all truth becomes subjective, but the real truth, the real human reality, is only observable through those in an oppressed group, through the lived experience of the oppressed. And that's why the social binary and intersectionality is so important, because you cannot determine truth until you know who's the one really experiencing it. I need to know who's in the oppressed class before I can listen to their lived experience to know the truth of what human reality is, right? to show you that this isn't crazy talk, here's a quote from Charles Lawrence in a book called The Word and the River. There's a subtitle, but lived experience equals truth. Trust your own senses, feelings, and experiences, and give them authority, especially in the face of dominant accounts of social reality that claim universality over you. So if there's a dominant account, by dominant account we mean like if society says that this is wrong, by society you have to read dominant cultural hegemony, says that this is wrong, and you feel otherwise, and you're not in that dominant class, then you need to trust and give your feelings, senses, feelings, and experiences authority over that dominant account, because the dominant account has to be wrong. They can't know the truth. Oppressor groups are obscured from true reality by their privilege. Okay? Got that? The other thing that kind of ties in here is this idea of non-essentialism. This is, we covered the other day realism versus non-realism, that everyone in this room is a realist because we believe this room exists even if we were all to die right now. Like the room exists outside of us. Non-essentialism is like a philosophical belief that nothing has particular things that make it that thing, that there is no essence of what we call a dog. There is no essence. There is no dog essence that makes something doggish, right? It's a dog because we call it a dog, and it could not be a dog. And that it's this idea that everything is completely malleable and changeable through language and ideas. And that's where you get a lot of the LGBTQ stuff, where there is nothing that's essentially masculine or essentially feminine. There is no essential descriptions of you that make you male or female. It's all in your ideation of what you think male is. And if I don't think I'm a male, then I'm not a male because I don't think I'm a male, right? There's nothing that makes me essentially male other than my thoughts. That's kind of a weird one, but that's where you get a lot of the stuff you're seeing nowadays with how I identify, right? I identify as a bunch of different things. I don't identify as European, right? Or you've even had some white people identify as non-white, or you've had, there's that famous woman.
Rachel Dunn.
Yeah. Right. And that's where you get that.
That one was unapproved. Like,
right.
You can't get away with that. You can get away with a man calling himself a woman, but you can't get away with a white person calling himself black, because that was an oppressor to oppress black.
Okay, we're making okay time, but this stuff's weird, so it's hard to, I just want to make sure we get the major points. The last one's pretty easy to understand intellectually, not necessarily emotionally. Okay, we talked about presuppositions for several weeks in a row, right? Your fundamental truths. We talked about morality last week. Was that 2 weeks ago? We talked about. Okay. Okay. We talked about morality, right? And we talked about we all have a whole bunch of moral beliefs, but unbeknownst to you that they're in a hierarchy. We actually gave an example of someone lying to the Nazi who comes to their door and says, I don't have Jews in my basement, right? We might all believe in this room that lying is amoral, but in that scenario, what is higher in the moral hierarchy is not allowing the Jews in my basement to be murdered, right? So I allow myself to lie for the greater good of not giving up the Jews in my basement to the SS soldier at my door. Okay? This is their fundamental moral imperative, is equity. You hear everyone talk about equity now, and you might get it confused with equality. So equity is not equal to equality. Equity essentially means equal outcome. So equity, which is viewed as the final, is the success of the liberation of the oppressed, is equity, is their moral imperative, right? If they were going to lie to the Nazi at the door to achieve equity in their basement, right? Like that's at the pinnacle of their moral hierarchy. And what I mean by equity is a sign of liberating the oppressed, one critical part of critical theory is that anywhere you see non-equal outcomes is automatically taken as evidence of oppression. The reason there is a non-equal outcome in any facet of life, it's because of structures of oppression from these social binaries and from the cultural hegemony, the cultural ideology. Because there is cultural oppression towards non-whites, towards non-males, that is why we see an unequal outcome in how many millionaires are white or non-white, or how many surgeons are male or female, or how many football players, oh wait, let's not go there. But you see what I mean. So whenever you talk about people who bring up statistics of certain classes or groups are underrepresented, you hear that word, underrepresented. Black women make up 17% of the population, yet when I look at the nursing field, they only make up 8% of the nursing field. So the fact that those numbers don't line up, they're underrepresented, is because that there's oppression under the guise of racism in the nursing field. Anytime you find an unequal outcome, it's an evidence and the result of oppression by one of these isms: racism, sexism, classism, ableism, ageism. One or more than one of those is acting on that situation to produce the unequal outcome. The goal of all of critical theory is to strive for equity. That is their moral imperative. Okay, so those are my three premises. We got hierarchies are based on power and oppression alone. We got there is no such thing as objectivity. It's subjective truth is all that there is. Your lived experience is your truth if you're an oppressed person. And equity over everything. Equity being the pursuit of equal outcomes. And that inequity you hear everywhere, is evidence of oppression from one of these isms. So now, anybody good? Got questions?
Just saw a reality on this recently. Big tech company, I think it was actually Google, that announced a new hiring policy, making it mandatory for 50% female.
Yeah.
But for all new hires, you had to have 50%. So they weren't going to fire existing employees, but from now on, 50% female was mandatory.
But more than 50% of the applicants are going to be male, because more than 50% of the people who go into that field are male. So if you looked at it equality, you would get a stack of a male application, a female application, and treat them equally. But if you're looking at equity, you treat the female application better than the male application because there are fewer of them, but you want equal outcome.
Applying this theory to all facets of life, particularly employers, sports, things like that. I've already started to see it even in my own work, starting to see it really messing with people's ideologies, because it's It's no longer based on their skill sets.
Yeah.
It's based on some thing else.
Yes.
I'm
So-
not sure if it was, say, they want equal, like, at least 50% woman, but you
Yes.
can't go over 50% man, but you can probably go over 50% woman.
Yes.
Because they're the-
Female is the oppressed class.
Yeah.
Right.
It actually looks good
Yep.
if you go over.
Yeah.
That's why you'll never see, you need to have at least 50% male nurses. That will never happen.
Right. Or
We need to have at least.
Or we need to have some-
white wide receivers.
yeah, or more white people in the NBA.
Yeah.
Or more short people in the NBA because that's ableism, or
Lower the rim so that I can jam.
right. That's just cultural hegemony. We're gonna get into all this. You know, I almost wish I was in the bigger room because as we get in the later half of this, I'm gonna want to yell, but I will try not to because we're in a small room. So,
Small echoey room.
Did you see Coca-Cola's announcement training?
oh yeah, they got sued.
Did they finally?
I hope so. I think I heard that a white person sued them for racist, subjecting them to racist training at work.
Oh yeah, it was rough.
Sorry,
There you
I'm
go.
pulling the rug
I mean,
back.
it wasn't implied either, it was explicit.
Yeah, whiteness is bad. I mean,
No, they literally said,
Be less.
yeah, that's white. Yeah. Okay. All right.
But if you do be less white, then you're appropriating somebody else's culture.
Right. All right. Let's do some critiquing, because while I agree, it's easy to. It can be easy to take this stuff not seriously. I assure you, this is deadly serious. I mean, it's deadly serious to the point that, like, we already know what this produces, and it produces hundreds of millions of bodies stacked all over the world.
And it's taught at every K-12
The-
school. Every K-12.
Part of the problem, and if you go back and watch the pre-homework again, the thing that I really respect and enjoy about that video is he takes the time, which I'm going to try to do a little bit tonight, to focus on the truths that are included in these premises. So let's start with the hierarchy one. Let's go over this again. Hierarchies are only based on corrupt application of power to acquire more power and solidify domination. All domination or superiority of position is due to corruption and not because of actual superiority of ideas or capabilities. Oppression is not just acts of cruelty, violence, injustice, or coercion. It is also the imposition of ideology or norms. So if I'm imposing my ideology or norms or cultural philosophy on you, I am oppressing you. So again, we've changed the idea of oppression. So let's acknowledge some truths here. All hierarchies do involve and impart power. Boy, can't let that stand. It's on the internet. Hierarchies do. Hierarchies have been and are used to create real oppression in the world. Okay? So hierarchies can and do create real oppression. Dominant culture, you might hear people use this word, hegemony, are real and have and can oppress. Why do these things carry so much weight? Why are they so attractive? Because they're not wrong. That's why. They're not 100% wrong. They go wrong, but they're not wrong. Hierarchies do impart power. Your boss, like it or not, does have power over you. If he fires you, it can have major implications on your life. If you're at a part in your life where you're tight on money, you don't have a lot of savings, you just had a third baby, your wife just had, a hospital occurrence, and you have a lot of hospital bills, he's got a lot of power over you if he fires you, right? There is no way to avoid accumulation of power, right? When we elect officials and give them power to represent us, that is why it's part of the duty to try to make sure that they're moral people who believe what you believe so that they represent you well, because you're giving them power, right? That is why anytime we elevate someone in a hierarchy, it behooves everyone who collectively elevates that person to make sure that that person is worthy of elevating, because you're giving them power, right? Mike has power here. Big Fred has power here. They're swaying how your kids think, right? They're swaying how I think. They can affect your standing in the community, right? It is important that when we construct hierarchies, which we can't not, we already discussed, it's essentially not possible to live without hierarchies, that we do so open-eyed, knowing that imparting a hierarchy involves imparting power, okay? Sometimes less power if they're smaller hierarchies, like the captain on your basketball team has less power over you than your boss at work, than a whole bunch of other bigger power structures that we live under, right? Over time, those hierarchies have done a lot of oppressing of a lot of people around the world. And when I say oppressing, I don't mean imparting my cultural ideology on you. I mean the good old-fashioned kind of really brutal oppression of people, right? And sometimes that hierarchy does manifest in cultural norms or a dominant culture that creates real oppression, like the coercion, bad treatment, violence, the terribly sinful kind that we all recognize. There's a dominant culture in India right now that still acknowledges the caste system, which means if I'm in a higher caste, I can literally strike you in the face and it's not illegal. I can physically accost you because that is the cultural dominance, right? I had a colleague that went on a train a couple months ago in India, and he was in like a sleeper car, and it's like bunks, and there's a guy asleep on the second bunk up beside him, and this guy walks in the room, and the guy's asleep, and he just hauls off and hammer fists that dude in the face. Guy wakes up and sees who it is. The guy that punched him was in a higher caste than him, and that was his way of saying, get out of the bed, I want the bed. And the guy had to get out of the bed, get his stuff and leave, and got punched in the face. And that's all culturally acceptable because that's the ideology, right? So these things are not untrue, right? Sometimes. The question becomes, and where you really have to start nitpicking is when you look at the all-encompassing words that they use. Things like never or always, right? Yes?
I was just going to make a comment on the second bullet. The wording, using the word do there, implies all hierarchies do create real oppression.
Can.
On the second one, you said can and have.
Yes.
So I think it's like can and have
Yes.
created real oppression.
Yes.
Not all hierarchies do create oppression, so.
He passed the test. I said, be careful to the words. And that's exactly the type of semantics that you have to pay attention to. That's perfect. And that was totally not on purpose. I meant to say can and have created. But they don't always, okay? So that's what we're going to cover next with objectivity, right? Is can we decide that some cultures are better than others?
Just to point out, I wrote down what you said to me, and then you wrote down an abbreviated version of what was in your notes, so you didn't have to write as much, I could tell, because you read something. I wrote down what you said. You didn't have that. And then when you translated quickly in your mind so you could get on the board, because the word do was shorter, it has a different interpretation.
It has a different interpretation. Sometimes create real oppression, not always, right? So we have to acknowledge these. Where this premise falls short is when you start saying, yes, but they can, they have, they sometimes do these things, but what else is true about hierarchies, right? So what is also true about hierarchies? One, is that they spontaneously emerge and proliferate. I spelled that wrong. Proliferate. Hierarchies are so prolific in the world that we have tons of examples with which to analyze them, historical examples to look at where they went wrong or went bad. Like I said, if you think about it, anytime you're in a group or doing a group activity, they spontaneously emerge. Hierarchies do. And most often, or at least some of the time, it's based on a level of competency, efficiency, or usefulness that the hierarchy imparts in the activity you're doing, or they wouldn't spontaneously emerge. In fact, if you believe in the idea of the evolutionary natural selection worldview, that's the only way you can explain the fact that they spontaneously emerge in all different species, in all different types of any social activity. We also have tons of evidence throughout history that successful hierarchies, hierarchies that stay for a long time and that proliferate further, they become bigger and more complex, have to be based at least in some part on this idea, or they fall apart. If all of these things go away, any hierarchy in history where we've seen these three things diminish and oppression and corruption take over as the primary means by which the hierarchy maintains itself, they implode on themselves, they collapse, they cannot sustain, right? The weight of building a hierarchy purely on oppression or corruption causes the hierarchy to fall apart because it's no longer a useful, it's actually a detriment to the people who participate in the hierarchy, right? Now, that's a little bit of a circular argument to make because some people who are making the argument for critical theory might say, well, capitalism in Western society is imploding right now. That's why we're bringing up these new ideas, right? So, okay, so that's one truth. The other truth is that included in the hierarchy, right, is this idea of the dominant culture. Is that dominant culture is not always unquestioned or unexamined.
That's basically saying, like, why are you pressing us?
This is basically saying, which we got, in order to make this point, I have to contradict the second premise, which I haven't done yet. That idea that there are objective truths, that there is a way to use reason and rationality to try to discover truths. So to make this claim, I need to say that there is actually a way to use reason and rationality to examine aspects of culture and then decide which of these individual aspects of ideology we want to select as better or worse, right? So we just discussed the dominant culture in India, which is not the dominant culture we have here in America. Can I determine which one is better or worse based on evidence and rationality, right? And if we can agree that this one's better, then we can make a new dominant culture that maybe produces less of this. This is the reality we all know that happened throughout time in America as a prime example, but in other places as well, right? So there are fundamental societal ideologies and cultural norms that we all agree to, that we think are best, that we actually agree to them because we think they eliminate this as part of the hierarchy. And that is the idea of individual sovereignty and individual rights, right? Freedom. The necessity of a mutual moral framework, right? You don't even necessarily acknowledge it, but the reason society functions is that on the whole, for the big things, we all have general agreement on what's moral and immoral, right? Some of us don't, 50% of us don't think murder's a-okay, and the other 50% say it's not, right? That wouldn't work out very well.
Abortion.
It's hard to even realize that this is one of the cultural norms that we all subscribe to, but in Western society, we all appeal to rationality and impartiality as cultural norms that produce the best type of hierarchy in society, right? That a lot of the most important underlying ideas in our dominant culture actually have been very highly examined and questioned. And we've examined them over and over again, and we've decided that this is the culture that produces the best results and the least amount of oppression, the most freedom and justice for individual people everywhere, right? I mean, that is literally the idea of America, is we hold these truths to be self-evident, right? So when you read a lot of the sentences, which I didn't read to you earlier, but a lot of these quotes, if you pay attention to the semantics, they have words like the unquestioned ideology of the culture, or if you leave these unexamined, right? Well, these aren't necessarily fair claims for all cultures, right? Specifically for the idea of America, if you read the founding documents, God so blessed our country with a number of extremely brilliant young men who wrote their thoughts on why they were making the decisions they were making very explicitly and with very well-reasoned arguments over very many, many, many pages as to why they were picking these things as part of our culture, right? So there are aspects of our culture that are a little bit more arbitrary than others, like why we like blue jeans instead of these, and is that really better or worse? And who knows? That could change over time. But there are things at the bottom of our culture that are not necessarily oppressive or powerful.
Slavery falls into that, right? In the United States, there was a time when the dominant culture did not have a social issue with slavery.
Correct.
And then it was examined.
Correct.
It was determined that it was no longer fitting for the culture. I mean, it was part of the dominant culture that it was unquestioned, and then it became questioned because the United States and the people wanted to change that. Eventually turned into war, but
they examined it and decided it was unworthy as part of the culture so much that they were willing to go to war with themselves over it. So that's a high bar, right? Where if we're willing to go to war and and subject our society to hundreds of thousands of deaths, you know, in amongst ourselves, that's a high claim to this being examined. The homework video, if you guys go back and watch it, he spends a half an hour talking about lynchings and racism and how all these things are not that far in the past. And part of the reason that this critical theory is growing so strong and so appealing is because we are a little bit undereducated, a little fearful of really truly understanding like some of the things that happened not that long ago, but that it doesn't make the rest of these propositions right or good. Like they're not logically in line with each other. You can't say, okay, well, yeah, that was horrific, and boy, I really understand that now, and I do want to try to understand race and society better, but this still is illogical and actually will lead to bad and damaging effects equal on scale to slavery. Like, we don't want to go from one horrific wrong into another horrific wrong. Okay. I'm going to go through the next ones real quick because I want to get to the payoff. So, the next one is subjectivity, right? What's true about subjectivity?
Sorry. Objectively true?
It's good. It's good. That's a good, when they say all truth is,
I don't think any of us in this room are allowed to comment.
right? Well, I am because I'm at the top of the hierarchy, so. No, Frank Turk has a great thing where they say, all truth is, what's true for you is true for me, or what's true for me may not be true for you, like it's just true for me. He said, well, is that true for me? Because I don't think that's true for me. If it's true, it's like you get into this paradoxical loop of like, in the claim that objectivity is illusory, that is an objective claim, right? It's weird. So here's what I'll say is true about subjectivity is that it is really, really hard in non-physical disciplines. By physical disciplines, I mean like chemistry and math, to remove yourselves from all of your cultural and subjective biases, right? I mean, we all have a worldview, we all have an upbringing, we all have what our parents taught us. We all like some ideas more than other ideas. We all want some things to be true more than we want this thing to be true. So we have this, conclusion affirmation bias where like you want to look for evidence that supports your pre-existing notions, right? It's hard, but again, if you look at their semantics, it's not impossible to try to be impartial, right? We can use things like empirical evidence. We can use things like double-blind studies. We can do all sorts of means to try to remove our subjectivity to make an impartial, reasoned conclusion about complex subjects. So I don't lose it here. So remember, objectivity is illusory. No knowledge can be gained without being corrupted by the hegemony or by the cultural ideology. So all truth is subjective. Claims of objectivity are a means of oppression. Oppressed subjective truth is more valuable than the oppressing subjective truth. So subjective truth is judged on a value scale, and the more oppressed you are, the more valuable your subjective truth is, the more true it is. So the other thing that we need to recognize as true about this is that people's emotions are real. Okay? When anybody comes at you with a very impassioned argument, like the emotions they feel are real. But it's difficult to tease out which of those are justified emotions and which are unjustified emotions, or maybe less justified emotions. This is particularly true being that we only have our own experiences to go off of, right? The trueness in this that they play on is the fact that if I haven't been a black woman who's gay, and she has a lot of emotions tied up in her experience, it can be that much harder for me to try to understand whether all of those or some of those or less than some of those are justifiable emotions, right? And the justification of emotion is a touchy subject anyway. I feel like if this were on the real internet, people would be yelling at me just for saying that emotions needed to be justified, because we have to accept people's lived experiences, right? So those are the things that are true, but the things that are also true is that truth exists. We know that there is an outside world beyond any one person, and we can aspire to understand it, right? We can aspire to use our reason to put our subjectivity aside and try to understand real truths about the world. And reasoning and rationality are the only way to do that. They are extremely valuable tools for finding truths and generating meaningful and effective understandings of complex problems and solutions and cause and effect relationships. So, how I know that rationality and reasoning are not just means of oppression, right? That rationality and reasoning are my brain is looking for a word, are valid pursuits. Valid is not the word I'm looking for, but that are good pursuits, is that they've produced a lot of good in the world. By good, I mean useful things. They are how you come up with problems to complex, or solutions to complex problems and situations. Rationality and reasoning, are how we've reduced oppression in the world, how we've reduced suffering, reduced hunger, how we've reduced all sorts of things that everyone would agree are negative, that we're trying to avoid. Critical theory is trying to get away from oppression. Well, rationality and reasoning have been used as tools to suss through the complexity of all these gray areas to help us come to ways that actually reduce oppression for real. So they are, based on evidence, good things. You can't just throw them away and say all use of reasoning is just a means for oppression, because the evidence doesn't support that, right? And then lastly, if we go to equity above equality, we have to acknowledge that there has been oppression, like real oppression, in history, and not just distant history, in recent history, and that there are lasting effects in the world from that oppression that can affect outcomes, right? So there are things that have happened in the recent past that for sure we're still feeling the reverberating effects of today, right? However, we also need to acknowledge that outcomes in any human field are a convolution of many, many variables, right? Past political policy and oppression being one of them, but more of them, and perhaps the strongest ones, are personal choice, personal interest, your aptitude in a field, like how good you are at something, what your proclivities are, your personality traits. Maybe I'm more of a people person or less of a people person. Maybe I'm more of an introvert or more of an extrovert, right? The temperament you have, temperament being like how quick to anger you are or how combative you are. Your intelligence, your family history, luck, happenstance. The list goes on. There is an insanely large list of variables that impact why there might be a higher representation of women in the nursing field and a higher representation of men in computer science. And it's not just solely at cultural oppression. These other factors are very important, and when you do empirical studies, you find that certain ones of these are actually the strongest and most important, right? So that's another thing, is outcomes are based on a lot of things, sometimes least of which old policies and cultural oppression, right? I'm not saying that they don't matter. I'm not saying that, past political policies related to blacks don't have reverberating consequences today, but they are not solely responsible for explaining every difference in outcome. In fact, most of them they're not responsible for.
It's interesting from a business perspective how data is interpreted, because it's although it's the same kind of data, the results seem to be interpreted with a different response now. So when someone sees a deviation, like for gender, for example, somebody might have interpreted 50 years ago a completely different reason behind it. Oppression versus what, like you described. Maybe there aren't as many women who take high-risk jobs. So in the construction field, do the men get paid more? You look at what positions that the women apply for and that they get, and then the men apply for that they get. It's it's a misinterpretation of data because of a change in ideology.
And what's funny is, like, we actually know that I'll call it the discovery of the 5 major personality traits. So it's like the big 5 in psychology is like agreeableness, temperament, I can't remember. It's basically like your standard personality test you take, right? Population averages across those explain most of the things that we all know to be true, right? Women on average are more interested in people, less interested in objects. Men on average are more interested in objects, less interested in people. So you have any people-centric fields, you generally have an overrepresentation of women. Object-centered fields, you have an overrepresentation of men. We kind of all know that to be true, right? It's really, we'll go off track, but there are people that are good to listen to on that, like people don't know enough about statistics to even get this stuff. And do you guys have till 9? We good?
I gotta be out at 8:45, but
Okay.
I can sneak out.
Okay. Well, here's just another little math blurb. Everybody has heard of the bell curve, right? So the bell curve is just a normalized, oops, I drew that wrong. The bell curve is just a normalized shape. So these are both bell curves with higher what you call Q factors or sharpness factors. One has a smaller standard deviation than the other. So these both have the same averages. Imagine I drew it correctly, that's both at the peak, right? They have the same average, but one's flatter. It's a flatter distribution. So if you look at this and you said, this is 1,000 people, and this is what they score on a math test, men and women, on average, have the same mathematical ability, right? If you just pick randomly, they're going to score the same. But if you're only looking for people who are the best at math, the male distribution is much flatter. So if you just look at people who are in the top 1% of doing math, you have like a mathematics competition and you just if 10,000 people take this test, I only want the best 10, the people that score 10 the best. Well, that means you're way out here on this distribution, and for whatever reason, I think it's physical differences in the brain, but there's going to be like 8 men and 2 females. And so if you have an industry, same is true on the other end too. Then this is a very good explanation of why totally repetitive, extremely dangerous jobs that reduce your life expectancy are almost all overrepresented by men. And if you go to fields that are almost solely built on mathematical competency, that they're almost all completely dominated by men, right? That's both. This is why, all the coal miners and people that are hammering rivets somewhere in Malaysia are likely all men. And this is why everybody who codes finite element analysis code for engineers are predominantly men. Whatever.
That's also interesting is men make up like the majority of geniuses. They also make up the majority of psychopaths.
Yeah.
It's the women are more towards that center and we men are out in extremes on both sides.
That's our culture that made them do that.
Okay. To wrap up, we're going to look at the costs of critical theory. We're going to look at the conclusions that critical theory makes you draw, and then we're going to look at the outcomes. So what's the cost? The cost is truth and rationality. If objective truth does not exist, there are no objective positions based on rational exploration of evidence. Neutral positions are impossible because rationality and evidence are corrupted by the hegemony. So, neutral positions meaning like neither good nor bad. Like any truth claim is now good or bad based on the subject and whether that subject is oppressed or oppressor. So, we lose truth. I'm going to read you a series of quotes. The first one, not so bad. In order to understand the concept of knowledge as never purely objective, neutral, or outside of human interests, it is important to distinguish between discoverable laws of the natural world, such as the law of gravity, and knowledge which is socially constructed. By socially constructed, we mean that all knowledge understood by humans is framed by the ideologies, language, beliefs, and customs of human societies. Even the field of science is subjective. I don't really disagree with that one too much. I mean, the one word that I tried to stress is the word never, right? The concept of human knowledge is never purely objective. That's the semantics. But on the whole, I think we can all kind of agree with that a little bit, right? We even talked about it in the science and Christianity class. Science doesn't say anything, only scientists do, and scientists bring all their presuppositions with them, right? So we kind of agree with that one. Anytime you're drawing a conclusion from evidence, you have to examine the person's worldview and biases to assess the validity of the conclusion. So, okay, I'll buy that. But it's where they take it next where it starts to break down. So, first paragraph, everybody good. Like, there is a lot of subjectivity even in objective claim fields, like even in the field of science. Okay, I'll grant them that. An approach based on critical theory calls into a question that the idea that objectivity is desirable or even, I screwed that one up. An approach based on critical theory calls into question the idea that objectivity is desirable or even possible. So now we've gone from objectivity is maybe hard and we have to be suspect of our biases to is objectivity even a desirable thing to achieve? Get to language. Language is not a neutral transmitter of a universal objective, but language is the way in which we actually construct reality. Okay? So that's a reframing of language. So language, we talked about in a previous class, is how we conceive of ideas, how we explain ideas to one another and make sense of the world around us. And they're saying because there is no objective reality, in fact, objectivity is not even something that we should be striving after, now we're going to instead use language as the way to construct the reality we want because there is no real reality. So finally, we get to the idea that objectivity is best reached only through rational thought is a specifically Western and masculine way of thinking. So now we've gone to objectivity is really hard because we all have biases. Maybe it's not really possible to, maybe it's not something we even really want to try to go after is find objective truth. To now, any use of rationality to claim objectivity is actually Western and masculine.
That's pretty racist and sexist.
Which-
It's basically saying women and non-Westerners can't think rationally. I mean, that's if rationality is
No, what it's
Western
even
and masculine.
it's even worse than that. It's even worse than that. So, what is oppression? Oppression is violence. Oppression is also me imposing my ideas on you. And now I'm saying that not only can I not be rational, my use of rationality is a form of oppression, which is a form of violence. So by declaring the appeal to rationality in the search for objective truth as Western and masculine, I've now identified that rationality in the search for objective truth is actually oppressive, which means anytime that I try to use rationality or evidence to make a truth claim, I'm actually committing violence because I'm oppressing an oppressed group.
They've made movies about this.
Do you now see the linkages we're making? And we're going to get there next, but we're now linking ideas to violence. Ideas are becoming violence. So, in 4 quotes, all from the same book, okay, and this is in the video I sent you, all from the same book, we step by step go from subjectivity is hard to parse out, it's hard to find objectivity with your biases, to maybe objectivity isn't something we should even be striving after, to now claiming to be objective and using reasoned argument to claim objectivity is actually an oppression. It's actually violence against someone. That's cost number 1. Cost number 2 is value based on ability or competence. If all hierarchies are based on power and oppression, and all differences in outcome are a result of that oppression, then all value is attributed to the liberation of people from oppression, social justice. There is no such thing as hierarchies being predicated on ability or competence or intelligence or your effectiveness at doing something. Your business is not successful because you were smarter or had a better product or had a better idea. You only had a successful business if you're in one of these categories. because of your cultural dominance and your oppressor status, right? So as soon as all hierarchies are viewed through the lens of oppression and power and corruption of power, we lose the idea that there's value anywhere built on competence or ability, that ability or competence has ever produced a hierarchy based on the value. We'll see why that's important later. The other thing we lose, this is a cost. We lose individualism. Your identity as an individual becomes valuable only in so much as you represent an intersection of oppressed groups and therefore truths about human reality. So if I can only understand the truth about reality as part of an oppressed group, my value as an individual is really only tied up in my intersectionality, right? In what groups I fall into. Not only that, the group and the equity we're trying to achieve, right? Equity over everything, outweighs any individual's value. Gone are individual sovereignty, intrinsic value of the individual. Gone are individual sovereignty and individual value of the individual. If what I'm looking for is equity, and equity is the bottom of my moral hierarchy or the top of my moral hierarchy, then individuals are value only in their usefulness to the group or the cause of equity, right? And this is why anytime you see someone who's in one of these groups speaking out against this idea of critical theory, they really get cast aside as someone in one of these groups, right? They're not valuable intrinsically as a person. They're valuable only if they believe in this structure. The other thing that we lose that is based on individualism is responsibility for choice and individual guilt. Okay? Notice, nowhere have we talked about whether or not you're individually guilty of oppressing anyone. You are guilty through being a member of the group. So we are now in the state of guilt by group, not guilt by individual action. Okay? So individual guilt is a cost of this. You also lose individual responsibility for choice, because if hierarchies are only built on power and corruption, and they're not built on intrinsic value or competence, or if equity, so difference in outcome, is always evidence of oppression, then it's never evidence of personal choices you've made or could have made otherwise. So you lose individual responsibility. So all the things that are mainly foundational to the American foundation, the Declaration of Independence, they kind of go away under this structure. Good on those three? So I'm just going to read the conclusions and then we're going to wrap up real quick here with the outcomes. Losing my marker here. I had the cap off too long, I think. Switching to blue. So I'm going to read some conclusions. We'll see if they make sense given what we learned. So based on the premises and what we've learned, here are some of the conclusions that are required by critical theory, right? All cultural norms are dominant only by means of corruption from those with power. And those with power aim only at maintaining their current power structure. There are no intrinsic reasons or value in existing cultural norms that led to their prevalence. So there is no cultural norm that was prevalent because it actually was a better cultural norm. Hierarchies are a result of oppressive power only, and those higher in structures use corruption and power to maintain their position. There are no positions or structures based on merit or value of ideas. Ideology is only a means of the dominant group to maintain dominance and oppression. Ideas and the language used to propagate them become equivalent to violence. If ideology equals oppression, oppression equals violence, ideas become violence. Truth is only found in the lived experience of oppressed peoples. Claims of objectivity and reasoned or rational ideas are oppressive means by which the corrupt maintain power. Equity is the ultimate moral imperative. Means that bring about that end are all justifiable. It is the basis of the moral hierarchy, and therefore any other immoral action is the lesser of two evils if it is a means which brings about equity. And that sounds extreme, but there was a professor of ethics, I forget at what university, that was arrested during one of the Antifa riots, who smashed a Trump supporter over the head with a bike lock, and then in his statement to police said that he was morally obligated to do it because he's trying to fight the oppressive powers to bring about social justice and equity, right? So this is a professor of ethics. So these are not radical claims. There is evidence that these conclusions are real. So now,
whacking somebody over the head with a bike lock is not oppression, but happening to be white is oppression.
well, no, the guy he whacked was an oppressor. So
Yeah. So,
he
so
can't
the guy
oppress
who
him.
got whacked was oppressing. The guy who used
Yep.
it, like whacking somebody with a bike
Yep.
lock is not.
And it was the
oppression.
equivalent of lying to the Nazi at the door to protect the Jews in your basement. It was the lesser evil than trying to bring about equity, right? So here are the outcomes. And these are real important because I didn't make them up. So all the outcomes I'm going to pull are from what happened from 1919 to 1949 in the Soviet Union under Lenin and Stalin. So for you people under 30, if you haven't learned anything about what happened in the Soviet Union in the last century, you need to, because everything we learned about tonight is on the railway tracks to exactly what happened in that society, and it was absolutely horrific. If you're interested, I'll send you 2 videos you can watch after this. They're podcasts, they're long. They're absolutely horrific to listen to. It's a guy doing a book review over a guy who, the book is written by a Russian dude who survived the gulags of Russian society. And the things that happened in that society are horrific, and they are directly an outflow of these ideas.
And
So,
the podcast talks about the book you're saying.
yeah, it's a Jocko podcast. Yeah, it's an awesome podcast. So, here's an outcome. Righteousness or unrighteousness by group. Okay, we're going to go through the first few. I got more. Righteousness is imparted by group status. Because of the conclusions we just made from critical theory, if you don't agree with critical theory, you are an oppressor. If you're a member of a group, you're an oppressor. You are evil by the fact that you belong to a group, not by your individual actions. Okay, now we all know everyone is evil. We're all fallen short in the eye of the Lord. But let's take this from a secular viewpoint for a chance, right? Like, you're an evil or a good person worthy of life or imprisonment based on group identity. This is what leads to otherness. Otherness is foundational for all mass atrocity. You can't find a mass atrocity in recorded human history where otherness wasn't a necessary condition to make it societally acceptable. Whether it's Rwanda or Cambodia or tribalism back in native days, communism, they are an other, they're not in our group, right? It's us versus them, they're the other. We have to establish that you're an other and that your otherness is evil by itself. The fact that you're part of that group, the whole lot of you, is evil and needs to be destroyed. And it's through that framing that you get whole societies or large amounts of people to accept what otherwise they would never accept if I were to do it in this room in a one-on-one scenario, right? But everyone will buy into it if it's under a larger structure of an other, a group. Group identity is very dangerous. It's a requirement for large-scale atrocity. It's the only way. It's a crazy history, but it's literally where the idea of race came about. We used to just refer to people based on their ethnicity, like their cultural background, what country they came from. When the slave trade really started picking up, which was largely black, tribes who were more warlords, had more power in Africa that were participating in the slave trade of capturing lesser tribes and selling them to white people. So there was multiple ethnicities and races all involved with the slave trade all over the world. But when it started to come to America, or actually more so at that time, it was Central America and South America, and people were really started to be confronted with it, it started to become very unpalatable. In fact, in a lot of the places where it was first started, it didn't take off really well, because if slavery were to happen in front of you now, you would be so affronted by it. Like, to watch someone whip someone else or beat someone else and treat them inhumanely, it's hard for you to accept that. And how you accept that is by, as a culture, we're just going to start treating these people as an other. And that's where the idea of race, you can actually find that the start of the idea of race in the slave trade, because they needed a category with which to treat black people as non-human or subhuman in order to make it okay as a society. We can all relax and we can palate this treatment because they're lesser, right? It's the same thing that happened with the Jews and the Nazis. You had to get to the point where the Jews were insects. They were others, not worthy, so that you could then palate as a German citizen, knowing this is true in Cambodia and Rwanda, like everywhere, otherness is critical, okay? This is also super critical. We're all fallen. We all have these tendencies to want to blame others, to be envious of others, to be bitter and resentful for our own misfortunes, okay? If you subscribe to a worldview that all outcomes, particularly those that are less beneficial to you, are because you're being oppressed by an oppressor, you can become resentful and bitter towards the people who are oppressing you. Because now they are the reason your life's not going so well, or you're not doing well, or why am I poor, right? That guy is the reason I'm learning and everyone's telling me that he's keeping me down. If society could just get rid of these oppressors, we'd all be doing better. And in fact, he becomes the object of my hatred because I've been taught that I'm his victim. I'm not responsible for my state in life. And I become bitter, resentful, and envious. righteously envious because he doesn't deserve what he's got. He's only got it through corruption, power, and oppression of me and other people, right? You can see how this just festers negative emotions. This is what happened in the Soviet Union too, amongst the peasantry, right? The guy who was better at farming and therefore had a bigger farm than you and actually was wealthier than you, he was only better because he was corrupt and oppressive. And so we go get to steal all of his stuff and kill his children and burn his farm, right? So this is bad because it leads to bad emotions. Okay, whoa, so if those two aren't bad enough, anybody feel like those don't come out of this? I mean, you get righteousness by group, not by individual. You get victimhood status. We're already seeing both of these things, right? Okay.
What drives the news? Victimhood.
Here's the really scary part. Not a single one of these outcomes, again, am I making up. These all happened. And you can see how they will happen again if we don't catch ourselves. The whole idea of critical theory is built on the fact that the cultural hegemony, the ideology of the dominant culture, is oppressive definitionally in nature. Oppression is violence. You see this connection to where not only is objectivity difficult to achieve, objective truths are not even something we should try to claim, and now anytime I do try to claim objective truths based on evidence, that's actually evidence of my own oppressiveness, like I'm oppressing people. Ideas become violence. Have you guys ever seen a news story yet where someone says, he assaulted me, or this is violence on me, and where people are just talking to one another?
Just like that, what you just said about the bike lock, and the guy with the bike lock, he uses ideas.
And it's justified because he's combating oppression. If everything's based on oppression, if you truly believed that society and the government was wholly built on corrupt power and oppression, I would be on your side that we should be doing an uprising to try to make a new government. That's happened in the past. That's how we got America, right? If we were all underneath Stalin right now, I would say, yeah, we are being oppressed. It's time to uprise in force.
A really popular one of those ideas being violent is the verbal notion of not referring to someone by the pronoun of their choice. That's become.
Next is examples.
Yeah. That one's getting hot. Now.
Dude, there's worse stuff than that.
It's starting to enter businesses, and they're actually starting to make it mandatory.
Is it really?
Yeah. You can actually reprimand the common businesses. Part of the new employee onboarding process. Probably annual review as well. What pronoun do you want to be called now? So that everyone's aware. And if somebody intentionally uses the wrong pronoun, it can be brought to HR.
Sure you could. Change that every day.
I think that would be the violent idea.
There were 70 or 100 pronouns around.
All right, I don't want to scare you guys, but if you don't know anything about the Soviet Union, you need to learn about it. It's absolutely horrific what mankind can do detached from the truth of God and the gospel. So
we can see it as well. Look at Egypt in the Bible. Israel.
this is true, right? We can see how critical theory would lead us to this. You hear it in the news all the time. We can justify violence against the oppressors. Oppression happens through ideas. Ideas then become equivalent to violence, which makes me justified in using violence against ideas. If it's truly oppression, I can then justify the government in using governmental power to punish ideas as though ideas were violence against other people. What makes that even worse is now we've already agreed that we have guilt by identity, by group identity. The appeal to evidence and rationality is already a sign of oppression, of your oppressiveness, which leaves us with accusation becomes guilt. If someone in this category accuses someone in this category of something, they are guilty already. Right? This group is already unrighteous. Any attempt to use objectivity or evidence and reasoned argument to say I'm not guilty is just further evidence of your guilt. And therefore all you need to do is be included in one of the oppressor groups and be accused by someone in one of the oppressed groups, and your guilt is assured. The scariest part, there's probably not a single person in this room who can't find themselves on both sides. That's the whole point. This is infinitely long. Every single person is on both sides, which means that society, under the negative emotions of envy and bitterness and resentment, gets to the point where a neighbor all needs to do is get angry at his neighbor and email the government and say, he said something bad about Stalin, or he doesn't believe in, he's not a true believer. And that's literally what happened in the Soviet Union. The list of things that could get you considered as a wrecker, someone who didn't believe in the cause, they had other names for it too. They ended up just coming up with generic derogatory names for people who weren't true communists. And that's all you needed. You needed a single individual in society to get mad at you and make a single accusation that you were a wrecker. That's just a generic claim that you're not a true believer. And they'd come arrest you and put you in the Gulag.
And that's kind of happening now, like with turning in people for COVID and everything.
That's a very scary thing, is that we are getting socialized through the pandemic to becoming more okay with tattling on your neighbors and your community to the government. All right, and here's the last couple. You get the failing of societal structures. By that I largely mean the economy, the monetary system, the health system, the technology or production, industrial system. Because if all differences of outcome are only due to oppression, and we have to erase differences of outcome because equity at all costs, eventually anyone who's competent at anything and therefore rises in excellence status will be accused of oppression, found guilty, and thrown in jail, leaving the incompetent to try to run things wholesale. And that's why anytime that this type of idea has been tried at other places, eventually it collapses under its own weight. So in the Soviet Union, they literally, eventually over time, threw all their doctors in jail, threw all their engineers in jail. They literally threw their entire educated academic class in jail because of this type of idea structure. And you can see, it sounds crazy, but you can, if you walk down the line, you can kind of see how it would come to that. It started with the farmers. So the first thing that happened was they had nationwide famine. So before World War II, when the communist revolution was first going on, the farmers in the local villages who were the best at farming and had the biggest farms, when they started this idea of, well, they're just oppressors and they don't deserve that. They only got that because they used corruption to take from you. And so all those farmers got thrown in jail and their farms got burned and their families got raped and murdered and they were thrown in jail. Like, well, guess what? All the best farmers are now not farming. And the people who weren't very good at farming or who were drunk and angry to murder them are now left to farm. And eventually, if that happens over a wide enough area, you get a nationwide famine. That happened. So then what happens? Well, then the government's trying to control all the means of production and they're trying to send food everywhere and send the trains everywhere, and the engineers say, hey, we don't have the infrastructure for this, we can't do this. And guess what they get called? Non-believers. You're telling us we can't do it because you don't want it to happen, and you're actually an oppressor because you're in this class. So they throw all them in jail. It literally happened to all their systems. It's like, it's almost comical if it wasn't comical, right? They ate their entire civilization alive from the inside out in the most horrific way. So eventually you'll get the failing of societal structures if you don't believe in hierarchies at all. If all hierarchies are based on power and corruption, and you destroy any hierarchy that naturally produces itself, eventually anyone who's good at anything will disappear. And lastly, if you pursue the equitable paradise at all costs, all atrocities become justifiable. So you've seen that in other places. So we basically replaced the economic paradise of Marxism with the equitable paradise of critical theory. That everyone in all these groups is perfectly equal in all categories of society, in all pursuits of human pursuit. They're all equally represented. That's their new paradise. And if that's your foundational and moral imperative, all other atrocities become justifiable. I know we're way over, but if you think that none of these outcomes can or will happen again in the U.S., or in the Western states in general, Western civilizations in general, here's a few examples. Canada, you got Bill C-16. If you don't use someone's preferred pronoun, it is considered a hate crime similar to misdemeanor assault and prosecutable with jail time.
That's a real thing in Canada.
It's a real thing in Canada. Language is perpetuation of ideas. Ideas are violence. Language and ideas become prosecutable as violence. In Canada, they have social justice tribunals. So there's a social justice tribunal on Ontario. It's a bench of social justice judges that hear all types of civil and small court criminal cases where they try to resolve disputes between landlords and tenants, hear appeals from people seeking social assistance and complaints from those who feel the service they receive from children's aids or whatever has been unfair. And basically the tribunal's goal is to apply justice with the idea of oppressed or oppressors in mind. So if you're a landlord coming to a small claims court because no one's paid you rent for 3 months, and the renter is in one of these groups, and you're in one of these groups based on your intersectionality, if the renter is oppressed and you as the landlord are the oppressor, the court is going to take that into account and maybe say that the renter owes you less than contractually you agreed to, because we have to try to reach equity. This person's been being oppressed for so long that we actually have to treat people unequally now to get back to equity status, right? Equity, not equality. We actually want to treat people unequally so that we can more rapidly get close to equity, equal outcomes. Basically revenge. So now, if you have any small claims court stuff in Ontario, you go in front of the Social Justice Tribunal and they'll factor in the amount of previous oppression you've been subjective to try to make the outcome of the court trial more equitable, not equal.
So they remove the oppressive judge and replace them with a panel of oppressed, qualified
Correct.
truth givers.
This one's crazy, but like I kid you not. Mathematics and the sciences are becoming racist.
I was just reading something about that.
So this is the American Math Association, American Mathematicians Association. It's a nationwide professional group for math. It's like an engineering association.
A bunch of people with pencils up their bums.
This is a quote. "It is time for all members of our profession to acknowledge that mathematics is created by humans and therefore inherently carries human biases. Until this occurs, until we acknowledge this, our community and our students cannot reach full potential. The time is now to move mathematics and education forward towards the pursuit of justice." racial justice or critical theory justice. So, there is no objective reality. 2 + 2 = 4 is human knowledge, and all human knowledge carries human biases. The Boston school system, the greater Boston school system, like the greater Pittsburgh public school system, just dropped all math proficiency tests for getting into their advanced mathematics classes.
Dumbing down in America.
Well, the outcomes were not equitable. I have a standard math test to get in an advanced math class, and only 14% of black kids are getting in, and there's 20% of black kids in the population. That's an unequal outcome, which is evidence of
Racism.
Oppression.
Mathematics is now racist.
oppression, right? So, Oregon, the Oregon Department of Education recently encouraged teachers to register for training that encourages ethnomathematics and argues, among other things, that white supremacy manifests itself in the focus on finding the right answer. This is a quote from the document that the Oregon Department of Education put out. Part of the toolkit includes a list of ways white supremacy culture allegedly infiltrates the math class. The focus is on getting the right answer, and students being required to show their work and other alleged manifestations these are manifestations of white supremacy in the classroom. The concept of mathematics being purely objective is unequivocally false, and teaching it is even much less so. The document for the Equitable Math Toolkit reads, upholding the idea that there are always right and wrong answers perpetuate the idea of objectivity as well as fear of open conflict. So they're saying the idea of objectivity is a manifestation of white supremacy in mathematics. The Oregon Department of Education Communications Director, Mark Siegel, also defended equitable math education programs, saying it helps educators learn key tools for engagement, development strategies to improve equitable outcomes for Black, Latinx, and multilingual students, and join communities of practice. So, equitable math is math that produces equitable outcomes for people in these groups. So until everyone gets the same scores on math tests equally across all groups for all time and all ways that we can slice and dice people, math is ismed. Racist, sexist, genderist, whatever ism or ist you need to come up with for all these rows. We're losing truth, right? One of the costs was truth. And then the last one is an example for value. You know, I said one of the costs was value based on productivity or ability. Value in the economic system is being redirected to social justice. There's an entire multinational effort right now to do something called the Great Reset, in which it's perpetuated at first by the World Economic Forum. This is big league stuff. We're talking about they got over $5 trillion in annual revenue of businesses signed up to buy into this, where now instead of just your financials, like your income statements and your cash flow statements, all the accounting stuff being used to assess your stock value as a company, like how much profit you're making, how much revenue, how much stuff you're selling. They want to account in and in fact make the dominant factor for the value of your company something called an ESG score. And that's environmental, social, and governance score. They're going to assess your company on how well it does with environmental justice, social justice, and how well it governs the people that it works for, how equitable it treats, and how non-oppressive it treats its workforce. and you get an ESG score, and ESG score is already starting to dictate companies' access to loans, access to stock markets around the world. Like, the way they want to go is that for you to even have your business listed on the New York Stock Exchange, you'd have to have a tribunal, like in Canada, some body of social justice judges say that your company scores high enough on caring about environmental justice, social justice, critical theory, and lack of oppression in your workforce before you would even be considered for any loans. It's basically like a cultural score. It's similar to what they're doing in China right now, if you knew anything about that. You have like a social score in China attached to you that the government keeps track of, and you can get negative points or positive points, and it's kind of like your credit score, but it's based on a whole bunch of other things, like how much you love the government and how much philanthropy you do, and whether or not
If you recycle and.
whether or not you've been caught speeding recently, and you get
facial recognition.
you get points or negative points. Yep. If you get caught littering, you get negative points. So anyway, they're doing that for Western economies now with this ESG score. So there's stuff you can look up on that. So that was a really long one, guys, and this room's getting hot. But
My question is, who's pulling the strings on all this? Because it's not all those different groups that are individually doing this, but there has to be one group or one who's overall that's trying to pull all this together.
there is no one person. I mean, it's largely a success, in my view, of the communist movement, right? I mean, if you read a lot of the old school books from the 60s and 70s, Cass Sunstein stuff, they played the long game. They said how they were going to do it, and they did it, and it's worked. All the people who believed in Marxism and thought that the only reason it failed before was because they didn't do it right, they became our academics. They infiltrated the university. They've infiltrated now secondary education. Then they teach generations of children this stuff. And that's how it's happening. It's happening because they're who largely we trust to educate, our young, bright-minded young people out there. So it's really a groundswell through indoctrination of the youth.
Because if there's no truth, then all sins are acceptable.
Yeah, and what
so
you
it's just a natural progression of eliminating those who hold some truths to be self-evident. If you eliminate the authority that holds to that, then you open the door to sins no longer being sins. So not only society doesn't oppress people who sin by choice, but now the people who are being oppressed, which in many categories are people who just are outwardly sinning from a biblical perspective, now their categorization of their behavior is now acceptable. And then sin is now acceptable. Actually, it's mandatory that it's acceptable.
Yeah. The other thing that makes it really appealing and easy to proliferate is like, it feels good. Like, I've often found that like the truth is really hard to figure out, right? You gotta suss through a lot of complex messiness to like understand the true complex relationships of, why society is the way it is, why some people aren't doing well, and why. But a lot of what they ascribe to is emotional affirmation. And when you start participating in this, you get self-righteousness. You get righteousness. Like, I become righteous by becoming a believer in this. Just by believing. By believing that I'm white, racist, oppressor, like I am now woke and I'm helping people and I want to do good and I don't want people to feel bad, and it is unfair that this person was born poor and this person was born rich, and that doesn't feel right, and I just want things to feel good. I want things to feel fair. And then you don't really analyze, well, like, what is fairness? Well, this is why, this is a thing that some people talk about now. It's still pretty controversial, but like, I truly believe that empathy is not a good way to come up with solutions. Sympathy is okay. So sympathy is like trying to understand. Empathy is when you try to put yourself in that person's shoes. The problem is, if I only put myself in that person's shoes, that subject, my view is limited to that subject, right? So when I say, oh, this is unfair and I want to change this because she shouldn't be poor or suffering right now and he shouldn't be not suffering right now, what I don't think through is, what are all the bigger long-term implications if I build a system around taking his stuff and giving it to you? And it's like, well, if we extrapolate, does that actually work? And I can't really do that if I'm empathizing. If I'm in her shoes, then my biggest concern is her emotions because I'm in her shoes. I want to satisfy her needs at all costs because I'm in her shoes, rather than like, what is the grander, more complex truth that's a lot harder to suss out. And that's why I think a lot of these are so appealing to young people, is just because it feels good. It's vindicating. You know, unfairness is bad. People shouldn't feel bad about themselves. How dare you tell me that what I think is true is wrong? Or how dare you tell me how I feel is wrong to feel that way, right? This idea that an emotion can be unjustified is an offensive thing to a lot of people. And they think they have a right for some reason, because it's an emotion, to not be offended. Like, anything that might offend me has to be wrong because I shouldn't have to be offended. And I think kind of as we grow up, you mature and realize that, like, I shouldn't have been offended at that. I was not justified. He was trying to help me. Or, you know what, that was a stupid idea. I was just insecure, and my emotional reaction was actually a hindrance to me getting better or learning. And until you have those experiences and you're stuck in that, I don't want to be challenged, I don't want to be made to feel guilty, or I don't want to be made to feel wrong, or I don't want to be made to feel uncomfortable. Like, that's where a lot of this, I think, is so palatable and wrapped up in, is like, if there is only subjective truth and whatever I feel is true, then nobody can make me feel bad about what I believe. Nobody can tell me I'm wrong in what I believe. And it makes you avoid all those uncomfortable emotions that we all had to deal with to become smarter, more mature, more knowledgeable, better human beings. Like, how you gain knowledge is through getting embarrassed that you had a wrong idea. Yeah, through getting educated by your parents that you throwing a hissy fit and feeling like you've been wronged is not always justified. And in fact, when you get on the other side of it, you'll agree that it was not justified that you felt that way. And now you're a better person for it, right? It's like, if you hold on to these beliefs, you never have to go through that maturation process, in my view, which is why it's so appealing to young people, because that maturation process is hard. You guys will figure it out. It's going to suck, but, you know, give it 40 years. It'll be better.